embarking on her spiritual journey with Brahmrishi Vishvatma Bawraji. She has dived deep into Indian culture at Varanasi and draws on the ancient wisdom of the Vedas, Upanishads and the Gita, bringing the light of knowledge into the deep practice of the 8 limbs of yoga in daily life. She is traditional trained and guided in Maha yoga, as well having had a traditional Sanskrit education in Varanasi for the last 14 years, winning the gold medal for the Shastri course and coming up top of her university class during further studies. She has broadcast lectures and taken part in discussions on the radio and continues to teach in India as well as internationally. She is co-founder of Brahmrishi School of Yoga and Divine Light Retreats, a Vedic Gurukul and international NGOs promoting Sanatana Dharma, Bharatiya Sanskriti and yoga as a way of life. Thank you, Divya. And I know everybody will enjoy your lecture very much.
Thank you very much. Guru Brahma, Guru Vishnu, Guru Devo Maheshwara, Guru Sakshat Param Brahma, Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Om. Pranam, and welcome to the second keynote of the Kashi Yoga Festival. And it's a great pleasure to talk to you today about, I think, what is my favorite aspect of yoga, and that is the eternal unity. So when I was asking Swamiji, what shall I talk about this time, he came out straight in a second that eternal unity and chitta, the media of manifestation, which we'll have tomorrow. So I hope that you'll enjoy the presentation. We'll also have questions, deep questions about perhaps your life or the presentation that we can discuss after the presentation. It won't be a very long one. So let me start by sharing my screen with you. So eternal unity really is what yoga is. And how we come to that, I will show you in the scientific basis as we go through the presentation, drawing on the Vedas, the Upanishads, Yoga Darshana, even the Ramcharitmanas, Mahabharatam, and the Gita. So here we have, in the picture, we have some young brahmacharis from the ashram who practice yoga on a daily basis. When I say they practice yoga on a daily basis, I mean they do the kriyas of yoga. Well, hopefully, through the bringing this practice in their life as a way of living, we hope that it also draws them inwards to see themselves. And you can see this young brahmachari, Shubham, is very clearly drawn inside. So we know that we know that yoga is as old as existence itself. In the beginning, when human beings were on this planet and we had the rishis, the seers, at that time, they understood that this universe was one existence. Vasudeva Kutumbakam. Meaning that this world is a family. Not just only is it a family, it had the awareness of Kutumbakam, meaning that this planet, this existence that we are aware of our communities and people on earth, is a very small part of this infinite divine existence. And in those times, we didn't have different country borders and different castes and colors and religions. We simply understood that Paramatma, that infinite consciousness, is what is our source, is our father, and that this earth is our mother, and this whole universe, our home. And even if we look at potentially Yogadarshana, that perhaps is 2,500 years old, even there very specifically, it talks about the no splitting between the castes and the colors and the actions in life. So I mentioned that yoga comes from the very beginning, and indeed, the very beginning means that there's this Paramatma, this infinite divine consciousness, Parabrahma, Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahma, that is truth, is knowledge and eternal. And from that manifests Hiranyagarbha. And Hiranyagarbha is described in the Rig Veda. Hiranyagarbha samavartat agre bhutasya jatta patirekasita sadadara prithvim jamutimam kasmai devaya yahavisha videma. So this Rig Veda mantra is telling us that in the very beginning, there is Hiranyagarbha. Hiranyagarbha literally meaning golden womb. This golden divine energy that's manifesting from this infinite consciousness, through which then the earth, the land, the skies, water, space, Akash, and everything beneath it is manifested from this golden energy. And this is what holds up the earth and all of the realms. And that Hiranyagarbha is not something that in that time, in the beginning of manifestation was and isn't now. No. This is a continuous existence. And so that as long as there is manifestation from the Paramatma into nature, so Hiranyagarbha, being that means, will always remain and can be realized with your real eyes inside. And from that we have come. So just starting, when we say yoga, the eternal unity, let's look at what the words yoga actually mean. Because in Sanskrit, we know that words and their meanings are eternal. You can't separate the word, the sound, and the meaning and then change them to others, because each word has a specific vibration. It has a form. Just as those of you who were in the sound room just now, you'll be aware that the larger instruments had like a deeper sound, and then you had the tinkling of like the rain sound of those little pieces of metal. So each different shape has a different sound, and that's the same with words and their meanings. We can't separate these apart. So Panini analyzed Sanskrit words and was able to shrink down the hundreds of thousands of words in Sanskrit to 2,000 root verbs. And in these root verbs, we've been given two things. Yujang Samado, meaning samadhi. In the meaning of samadhi is the word yoga. And it also means samabhuti. Samabhuti, samadhi, meaning stable intellect, balanced intellect, perfect intellect. And the second, yujir yogin. And this is the meaning that we'll be concentrating more on today in today's talk. Yujir yogin. So in the meaning of union with what? Your real self, that infinite, unlimited, divine Parabrahma, Paramatma, as opposed to the individual Jiv Atma that is limited and tied to nature, attached to nature also. So potentially, followed the same tradition as we see in the Shastras, the treatises from ancient times, which is that basically the whole philosophy can be shrunk down to 4 shlokas. The first being Atta Yoga Anushasana, meaning that now I'm going to tell you about the discipline of yoga. And I would say, and Guruji also said, again also, because that Anushasanam indicates that Anu, that following from before, Shasanam, discipline. So then he goes on to say, Yogas Chitta Vritti Nirodha. So he's saying that yoga is where we are Nirodha, the means that gets us to that Nirodha, that state of consciousness. Nirodha meaning without any limitations. We'd say in Hindi, asimit. And so you've got the chitta, which is when we talk about the individual, and we'll talk about more tomorrow. The chitta, which is in the individual form, like the mind. But when it's in the universal, when it goes to the cosmic level, then the chitta and the buddhi are the same. And that's why, and Shastras can be very confusing, because there's a difference between the limited, the vyashti, the individual, and the unlimited, the cosmic form. And so the difference is that when we're talking about the limited in nature and the individual, that chitta can be equated with the mind. And when we're talking about the cosmic, then the chitta can be equated with the buddhi, the intellect. And through the means of yoga, we go beyond these vrittis, which are the modifications of the mind. And we'll go into those a little bit further on. And we go, and they are in the attachment between the chitta and with the object of the senses. So the mind connects with that object of the senses through a sense. And that asakti, that connection between the two, that's where the vritti is, the modification of the mind. And so when we get liberated from that, we exist in that state of consciousness, nirodha, without any limitations. So that state of union, that yujir yogi, coming together with that nirodha, is attained through the practice of yoga, which is the aim, union, and samadhi, but also the means of practice, whether it be Ashtanga Yoga, Yama Niyam, Asana Pranayama, Pratyahara, Dharan, Dhyan, Samadhi. Or Kriya Yoga, Tapa, Swadhyay, Ishvara Pratyanani. Or Hatha Yoga, where you have the balance of the hum and the tam, the 2 pranas, the pran and the pan, becoming balanced. So the journey of life is from the initially manifesting through the universal, coming into the individual. And the aim of our life is to come back from that individuality to that universality. So what do all of these terms mean? What does universality mean? How and what are the things that are blocking us from this in life? So what is actually yoga? So the next shloka from Patanjali says, Tada drastu swarupe avastanam. Drastu is the seer. Swarupe is the form. Avastanam, in its original, and that stan means place. Avastanam, back in its original place. So, tada drastu swarupe avastanam. So through the practice of yoga, through the awareness of yoga, the realization of yoga, what happens is we exist back in our infinite, divine, unlimited existence, that param atma. So spiritual is that adhyatma. And we know that when we know the param atma. So through the process of yoga, attaining that level of consciousness of samadhi, we once again abide in our real, infinite, divine existence. So the Upanishads told us what life actually is. And they told us that life is like a stream flowing between two riverbanks of birth and death, constantly flowing, and there's constantly birth and there's constantly death. And even more enlightening is what we're told in the Mandukya Upanishad. Yata natyasanda manasu maitrestam gachanti numnama rupe vihaya tata vidvanama rupat vimukta parat param purushamupaiti divyam. So you all, I'm sure everybody here has seen, either in real life or seen on the television or the internet, how rivers coming into an ocean become indistinguishable from the ocean. They give up their name and their form. And you cannot separate back out a river from the ocean. In the same way, when the seeker, that jityasu, that yogi that wants to know, that sadhaka that wants to know the ultimate truth, that paramatma, that param brahma, when they become absorbed in, again, paramatma, parabrahma, the individual name and form is left aside. And it really is as simple as turning from the individuality, the temporary, the limited nature, towards that infinite divine consciousness, turning the eyes from out to in. And so that the eyes may be open, they may be looking outside, but they see within and they are aware of truth. So Tulsidas told in the Ramayana in a very similar way to the Upanishads, and this is something that Madhusudana Saraswati, when in Varanasi, Tulsidas's Ramcharitmanas was not being accepted by the Pandits as a Shastri Granth. It's Madhusudana Saraswati who stood up and stood up for the Ramayana and saying that it did Ramcharitmanas actually contained the essence of the Upanishads and the Vedas, the Gita, the Mahabharata, Valmiki Ramayana, of course. And so Tulsidas said, Sarata jala jala nidhi mahujai, hoya chala jami jiva haripai, which means very much just the same as that mantra from the Upanishad, Mandukya Upanishad that we just had, that as a river on entering the deep ocean becomes still, in the same way, when the individual becomes calm and quiet, becomes peaceful after being merged into that paramatma, that param brahma, because, you know, it's a very small part, kutumbakam, that's becoming absorbed in that infinite divine energy. And so it causes not even a ripple as it comes into that ocean, and it just flows together with it. And you can understand the ocean and the waves being the form of individuality, and the ocean, that universal consciousness. And without that universal consciousness, without that param brahma, that satyam jnanam anantam brahma, there is no wave. And these waves are rising and falling, having birth and death within the medium of that consciousness. And what is happening is that our identification with our individuality is making us unaware of that universality, unaware of that eternal unity, because we're always united in the ocean. Without the ocean, there is no individuality. And yet we perceive our individual life, we perceive that consciousness is something separate from us, something that's outside us, and yet it's within us. Yatha pinde tata brahmande. Yatha brahmande tata pinde. Just as is in the universe, is in us, and as is in us, is in the universe. There's nothing different. And so that consciousness is within each of us in the form of the ocean, as we are each wave, rising and falling, manifesting and disappearing into that deep ocean of consciousness that is ultimately calm, quiet, full of knowledge, infinite divinity. So the secret is to realize this. And that peacefulness of that ultimate consciousness can only be expressed and experienced in the present. You can't be in a state now and have that peacefulness from the past or the future. It's here and now, with you now. And what happens is that every now becomes your past. So if you have peace now, then there will be peace that will be in your past and the potentiality for peace in your future. And so it's about being able to live in the here and the now and use our tools and our knowledge, our skills to the best of our ability in the here and now. For what? For that realization of our aim of life, that dharma, artha, kama, moksha, nam, purusha, artha, chatushtayam, that the four purposes of life are said to be dharma, artha, kama, and moksha. Moksha meaning mukti, that mukti from the moha, that liberation from the delusion that we perceive in nature. And the Vedas also tell us that our aim of life is that Brahma Nivarna, to be aware of that ocean of consciousness, that ocean of bliss. So Patanjali told us how we can attain that. He said, Sattva Purusho Yoho Shuddhi Samye Kaivalyam Iti. So, Sattva and Purusha. Purusha meaning that infinite consciousness, that unchanging divine energy. And Sattva is referring to the individual buddhi, and also going then down into the chitta of the mind stuff. And so it's saying that Kaivalyam, that Nivarna, that liberation is attained through getting the balance between the Sattva and the Purusha, the Paramatma and the mind stuff of the Chitta. So Patanjali is basically telling us that the problem is that how do we get tied into this nature? And it's because we identify with that individual mind stuff. We perceive that to be me. I'm tall. I'm short. I'm intelligent. I'm not very intelligent. I'm really good at knitting. I'm really good at painting. I'm really good at writing essays. And I'm not really good at cooking. All of these kind of things. It's an identification with these individual mind stuff, these vrittis and the chitta, which is the cause of tying us to the individuality instead of what we actually are and what is part and parcel of us. And so until we learn how to be free of identifying with our individuality and knowing the difference between the universal Purusha, Paramatma, Parabrahma, and the individual Chitta, that individual mind stuff, our individual mind, our individual intellect, our individual ahankara, ego, until we learn to be just the seer who is aware of those qualities, because it's not like those qualities are going to disappear. It's part and parcel of nature. but the attachment to them, the focus on them, turns away from the individuality towards the universal. And that's what we're doing when we practice pranayama, when we're using mantra, when we're doing meditation, and we're preparing for all of this through the yama, the niyama, the asana, the pranayama, and the pratyahara. So we've mentioned a little bit about yoga, and now I'm going to say a little bit about Sankhya. So in the Mahabharata, we learn that Hiranyagarbha, who I mentioned that we find written about in the Rig Veda, who's from the original existence, who is the first enunciator of yoga. And the first enunciator of Sankhya philosophy we find is also named in the Mahabharata as Kapila Maharishi. And he said in his very first shloka of the Sankhya Darshan philosophy, he said, Atha triveda dukantyanta nivrittir ajanta purushartha. He says that the ultimate aim of life is to be free of the three kinds of pain. What are the three kinds of pain? We have adibautic, which is individually related, adidevic, which affects us as a society. For instance, an earthquake or a flood or something affects everyone in its path, coming from nature itself. And adibautic, the individual, is something like what's happened in this pandemic, that whilst we all have been subjected to various rules, we've all been affected to a different degree, even though we may be all in the same place. Whereas everybody in the path of a flood is going to be affected. Everyone in the path of an earthquake is going to be equally affected at certain points. And what's the third kind of pain? Adhyatmic dukkha. Adhyatmic, we translate as spiritual in English, but it's really something way more than the meaning of spiritual. It's towards, adhyatmic, towards the spirit, towards that unlimited divine consciousness, that Paramatma. So this is the really deep meaning of the spiritual, being aware of that ultimate consciousness, knowing what we really are. So how can there be an adhyatmic dukkha, an adhyatmic pain, a spiritual pain? It's very simple. The pain is the knowledge, our knowledge of that separation from that infinite divine consciousness, being aware that we are limited, being aware that we're individual, and not being aware of our real existence, and being joined, that union, that yoga, that eternal unity with our real existence. That is what causes pain. So in the Tattva Samasa, he said something else. He said, Etat samyak yatva krita kritya syat na punasrivedena dukkana na bibhuyate. So, etat samyak yatva, having known that perfectly, known what perfectly? Krita kritya, the changeable and the unchangeable. Knowing the difference, being able to discriminate between the difference of what is permanent and impermanent. Being aware of that permanent, unchanging Paramatma. Being established in one's own self. Then we will never become overwhelmed by these worldly sorrows. Dukkena abhibhuyate. So this Tattva Samasa, which is also from Sankhya philosophy, is telling us that basically the secret is to, through discrimination, to become aware of the differences between the individual and the universal, and become established in that universal existence, knowing as a seer that there is the individuality, but we identify with that universal. And when we identify with the universal consciousness, that Paramatma, then we can never again be overwhelmed with the worldly sorrows. So what's causing these sorrows? Ultimately, first of all, is that separation from our real self. On a lower level, the Gita is described, the Patanjali is described, Vritaya, Panchateya, Klishta, Klishtaha. There are these 5 vrittis. I mentioned that these vrittis are between the mind, the chitta, and that attachment to the objects of the senses. And in that connection, that attachment, that's where we get the vrittis, the praman, vipareya, vikalpa, nidra, smritya. And these 5 kinds are either klishta, painful, or aklishta, having an absence of pain. Think about that carefully. Painful or an absence of pain. We're not being given an option that these vrittis can either give us pain or give us happiness. No, there's 2 options only. Pain or an absence of pain. Happiness is not one of the available things through these vrittis. So we want to, through the practice of yoga, yoga's chitta vritti nirodha, we want to get to that state of consciousness which is beyond the chitta and the vrittis through yoga, attaining that state of yoga, that nirodha, beyond limitations, infinite, divine, satyam, jnanam, anantam, brahma. And the Gita told us what we're actually doing that leads to all of this pain. He said, Sri Krishna said to Arjuna in the 2nd chapter, Dhyayato vishayan punsas sangasteshu vijayate sangat sanjayate kama kamat krodho vijayate krodhat bhavati sammoha sammohat smriti vibrammaha smriti brahmashata buddhi nasho buddhi nashat pranashyati. So it's telling us that there's 7 stages of downfall, the path of suffering. And it starts by concentrating on the objects of the senses. Now, I was just telling you a couple of slides ago about that being able to distinguish between the individual and the universal. And so not concentrating on those individual objects of the senses, because you have the mind, the objects of the senses, and then that attachment between the two, which is where those vrittis are. And here again, we're being told, concentrating on those objects of the senses leads you to get connected to them, becoming attached to them. And from that attachment, that desire for them, comes krodha, anger. And from the anger comes the delusion. From the delusion, you forget who you are. And from that forgetfulness of yourself, you destroy your intellect. And the destruction of your intellect is what leads to the complete and utter destruction of you. And so, again, in a different way, the Gita is telling us, hey, you want to avoid focusing on those objects of the senses. You don't want to get attached to those. You don't want to have a desire for those, because that's what's going to lead you to suffer and experience pain and even destroy yourself as an individual. And Patanjali told us one more thing, that what's the cause of pain? So we've seen that in one way he's told about the causes of pain, about the vrittis, and we saw that the Sri Krishna telling about the what's giving us pain. And finally Patanjali says, Trishta Trisha Yoho Sanyoge Heya Hetuhu. So Drastra Drisha Yoho Sanyoge Heya Hetu. So what's the drastri? The drasta is the seer, and Drisha Yoho, Drishya is the seen. So the contact between the seer and the seen, sanyoge, that connection between the two, that is the cause of pain. And really what that means is that connection, that contact that we make between the seer and the seen, which means that we're turned away from the infinite divine, because the seen is temporary. It's the nature of nature is temporary and changeable. So that's always changing. And that's going to cause us pain. And so really this again takes us to that adhyatmic dukkha, which is that the ignorance is of not knowing ourselves. And that is what causes pain, because through ignorance, we connect to those objects of the senses, the objects of nature. So how do we get to be free of these? So Patanjali's told us, Yogas Chitta Vritti Nirodha Tada Drashtu Swarupe Avastanam. And the Katha Upanishad tells us that Indriyanam Pratak Bhavam Udayastam Chayat Pratak Utpadyamananam Matva Diro Nasochyati. He says that when the stable-minded person, that sthit pragya, that stable intellect, that stable wisdom, that state of consciousness known as samadhi, stable intellect, when they understand that the senses come from out of the objects of the senses, and they merge and emerge constantly into those objects and out of those objects. And when we are aware of that kind of like that tortoise-like existence, which is given to us in the Gita, Yada samhayate chayam kumangani vasavisha indriyani indriyatebhyas tasya pragya pratishtata. So a yogi, that person in whom there's yoga, is able to, like a tortoise, withdraw their limbs and bring out their limbs as and when needed, the limbs of the senses. And so that stable-minded person is able to understand the difference between us and those objects of the senses. And when we know that, we no longer experience pain, we no longer grieve. Matva diro nasochyati. So we talked about that infinite divine consciousness and truth. And when we talk about truth, truth is on many different levels. In the Mahabharata, it said, Yadabhutaitam atyantam sasatyam iti memati. So that even speech that is for the welfare of mankind is truth. But that is temporary truth. And what we really want to know is that permanent truth, that infinite divine supreme consciousness that is all pervasive, that is always giving, that has no discrimination between each one of us. So we start with that foundation of yama and niyama, coming to asanam, sthira sukham asanam, that posture that's stable and comfort giving, but also that position where the mind also is stable and comfortable. That's what we're talking about when we say asanam, taking us on to the pranayama, where thought and breath are twins, as we discussed in this morning's lecture, bringing us to that stability. And Patanjali goes on to say, satya pratishtayam kriya phala shreyatvam. When one is established in the truth, it enables them to be the base of all the different kinds of fruits. It can have the successes and the ability to manifest the work and to, through their actions, to reap the fruit. But there remains no space. Kriya phalashrayatvam. Satya pratishtayam. There'll be no feeling of lackness in the life. There's contentedness, completeness. And that's my own experience through the practice of yoga, is that sense of completeness. So how do we know ourselves? Sankhya Nishta and Yoga Nishta is referred to in the Bhagavad Gita. And we can either make our chitta. Now, the individual chitta, I would say again, is that mind stuff, the mind, free from external influence and re-established in its original source. First through the cosmic, where it becomes one with the buddhi, the sattva buddhi, and it then becomes established in its own original source, that nirodha, without any limits. So the Sankhya Nishta and the Yoga Nishta, some people say I'm a Sankhya yogi or others like a hatha yogi. But really, if you really understand Sankhya and you really understand yoga, you'll understand then there's no difference. In fact, the Gita said, Shri Krishna said, Sankhya Yoga Pratakpara Pravattanti na Panditaha. So he is not a pandit who understands these as different. Both systems get us to the point where the organs and the senses are effortless with complete surrender to that Paramatma, that Ishvara Pranidhana, submitting our individuality to that infinite divine consciousness, abandoning our individual physical and mental and verbal activities, realizing that we're the ocean of consciousness rather than the wave, realizing that eternal unity. We are eternally united with that Paramatma, but we perceive through identifying with our individual mind stuff, with the individual qualities of the Rajaguna, Tamaguna, Satguna, we perceive ourselves to be separate, that I am ahankara, karta, supurusha na. So ahankara is that individual I, that I am the doer. Whereas that Purusha, that infinite divine consciousness, is never the doer of anything. Simply, you've got the manifestation coming from that infinite divine consciousness. But that individuality, that individual doer, starts with that ahankara. So when you get movement in the buddhi, in the intellect, then you get the individual ego coming, and then that leads to the mind. So movement in the ego then leads to the mind. And so you can understand that the mind is the child of the ego, which is the child of the buddhi. And Kathopanishad tells us beautifully what is actually attained. Yada panchavattishtante jnanani manasastaha buddhischana vichetaste tamahu paramam gatim. Paramam gatim is attaining that ultimate stage of consciousness, that highest consciousness, that Paramatma, the Param Brahma. And when the senses of cognition, the five senses, panchavattishtante, when they're inverted, towards inside, the intellect, a buddhi, becomes actionless. So I mentioned that movement in the buddhi led to the ego, birth of ego, and that movement in the ego led to the mind. So when you turn back and you invert internally, then the movement in the mind becomes stopped. Thought and breath are twins. So breath is stopped, thought is stopped. And then ahankara, the ego, that also becomes stopped. When that's stopped, that's where the intellect is actionless. And that is when you start to become just a seer, and you channel action. You are not the doer anymore. There's constant awareness. And this is known as one of these levels is nirvichara samadhi, where we're beyond the realm of thought, where there is that self-illumination. So initially in the first three stages of samadhi, savitaka, nirvitaka, which is with logic and without logic, and then you get the savichara with thought, and then nirvichara without thought. So in those first three stages, there's darkness, a great darkness. And then you get the dawn of light appearing. And that's coming in that nirvichara. And that ritamba pragya, that truth-bearing wisdom, starts shining. And that is what burns those seeds that were leading us to, in the mind, in the chitta, that were prompting us to engage with the objects of the senses. So we become free of that individual limited experience in nature, that changing experience in nature, and realizing that unity, which manifests in the form of eternal peace and knowledge and oneness. And that's the ultimate aim of life, which is again and again described in all of these different treatises. And the Atharva Veda tells us, Ashta Chakra Naudvara Devanam Pura Yodhya. So this is telling us that this body, this existence, consists of 9 gates, 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 nostrils, a mouth, and 2 lower gates. And note that it says Ashta Chakra, 8 chakras. This concept of the 7 chakras is much more recent. And it doesn't really change the big picture, because the chakra that's missing between the 8 and the 7 is that lalana at the palate. So really we're concerned with the Brahma chakra and on the way that Agya chakra. It says also that this place of 8 chakras and 9 gates is the dwelling place of the divine beings, and its name is Ayodhya. Ayodhya, Nayodhya, Ayodhya, meaning that place where there is no battle. And the battle happens in individuality. When you are in that state of eternal united consciousness, that ekatvam, that unity, then there is no battle, because the real struggle is us wanting to have permanency, but we're always getting through pointing our eyes outward. We're always experiencing that separation. So that Ayodhya also is referring to that third kind of pain, where Yodhya is that separation from yourself, your universal self, and Ayodhya is reflecting that eternal unity, that unity with our real selves. And again, talks about that golden sheath and that divine light. So I've told many times a definition of who is a yogi, and you can find this in the Gita. These are probably the most important 4 shlokas of the entire Gita, where Sri Krishna describes to Arjuna who is a yogi, what are the qualities of a yogi, how does he walk, how does he talk, how does he sit. And he says, Prajahati yada kaman savan pata manogatan atmanyevatmana tushtas tit pragyastadochate tukesha nukvamanaha sukeshu vikatspriya vetaraga bhayakrodas titadir munindruchate Yasavatranai visnai hastatat prapyam shubham nabhinandati nadveshti tasya pragya pratishtita yada samharte chayam kumanganeva savisha indriyani indriyatebhyas tasya pragya pratishtita. So the sthit pragya is the stable wisdom. So this is the quality of a yogi. And who has the quality of a yogi? He says that who's satisfied by themselves in themselves. So that is, where the knowledge of that infinite divine consciousness, and that we realize that we're part and parcel of that infinite divine consciousness, where we're balanced in happiness and pain. We see it, but we don't identify with it. And when we don't identify with it, we don't experience it because we're not attached to it. So we are aware that it exists, but we don't experience that pain that comes through the attachment. And without attachment, without fear, and without anger, he's a yogi. And beyond the pairs, so beyond all these pairs of opposites, beyond pain and happiness, beyond auspicious and inauspicious, beyond love and hate, and like a tortoise, being able to withdraw the limbs, the senses from the objects of senses at will. This is the definition of a yogi. So how do we do that? Mentioned in different ways to how to know ourselves. And the most important is this internal sadhana, this dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, which is defined as deshabandha chittasya dharana. Fixation on that one point, that object, whether it's our mantra or ideally our mantra. And tatra pratyekatanata dhyanam. Ekatanata is that oneness, that one-pointedness, that constant flow of concentration, awareness into that object is what is known as meditation. And the extraordinary thing is that we're actually meditating 24 hours a day. It's not that we turn off nature, we sit down and we're going to do meditation and we concentrate on our mantra. No, we're meditating 24 hours a day, every day, constantly. But the difference is that we're always concentrating on something different, whether it's on making a phone call, whether it's on finishing an essay or going to work or turning on the commuter, driving the car, whatever it might be. We always have a flickering focus. And so the meditation that can take us to that liberated, that nirodha, that beyond the limitations of nature, is when we focus on one object. And if we make that one object our mantra in all times, then tadeva artamatra nibasam swarupa shunyam eva samadhi. So tadeva artamatra, when giving up all of our individual forms, going beyond the limits of nature, when only that which remains, swarupa shunyam eva, is samadhi, that stable intellect, that paramatma, that param brahman, that stable awareness, that sthit pragya. This is that samadhi. And so what you'll realize is that this dharana and dhyana and samadhi aren't a step-by-step process, but something that are happening instantaneously together. So Patanjali, the Katha Upanishad describes meditation as tam yogameti manyante stiram indriya, tam yogameti manyante stiram idriya dharanam aparamatat bhavati yogo hi prabhava apyayayo. So this is just part of the mantra, and this important part is telling us that the stability, that stage of stability of the senses, where that sthit pragya is called yoga. And when we reach a stage of consciousness, we become free from distraction. We become one-pointed, and we need to be vigilant to maintain that one-pointedness. Even telling somebody about, I've attained this incredible state of where I feel this incredible stillness and peace, that is enough to lose it. We want to be very aware and vigilant to maintain that state of awareness of that yoga. And so really meditation itself is yoga, and everything we do before that is preparation to get to this state of consciousness. And we've discussed what the different techniques of meditation is, and we'll discuss those again this evening. But you can start with simply concentrating on the letters, which is number 3. And you can do that by imagining writing the letters. And then you can concentrate on the sound of the mantra. And then finally then concentrating on the mantra with its meaning, finally concentrating on the sound of the mantra with its meaning are the different stages of meditation. And being aware of the sound and the meaning comes gradually, simply by doing your mantra. I assure you, it gets you to that stable level of consciousness where these things manifest them by themselves. And never be worried that this stage is not coming, because that itself can be an obstacle to our progression. So Manusmriti said, Sarvam Paravasam Dukham, Sarvam Atmavasam Sukham. So Manusmriti is one of the Smritis. We have 2 classifications of Shastras, actually. We have the Shruti, which are given by the Rishis, by the seers, and that includes the Vedas and the Upanishads. And then we have the Smritis. And the rule of thumb is that if a Smriti contradicts a Shruti, a Veda or Upanishad, then we take what's written in the Veda or the Upanishad. So this Smriti, thankfully here, agrees with the Vedas and the Upanishads, and it tells us that liberation of the mind is the key to blissfulness. And this is really important. I've told you that the adhyatmic pain that we experience is actually as simple as this, that we perceive to be separate from that infinite divine consciousness. And so what we all want is peace and happiness. We want that experience of peace and happiness. And that is experienced when we experience this eternal unity, when we're aware of this, of our unity in that infinite divine consciousness, that ocean of consciousness. And so the Manusmriti is telling us that the liberation of the mind is the key to that blissfulness. So just in another way, being told a different thing. And why do we keep being told the same thing in different ways? Because everybody has an individual mind, ego, and intellect. The vyashti, the individual nature. And so we understand things in a different way, each one of us. And so different Shastras give us a different way of expressing them all, so that from one way or another, we get to understand it. So basically, in the language of yoga, it is that surrendering of our individuality to that universal self, the real self, Paramatma. And that is what we know as samadhi, that stable intellect. And there's a very beautiful way of expressing it. And Tulsidas said, Yaka jnana atyanta nipuna bhava parana paraye koi. Nobody with the mere verbal knowledge of the ancient Shastras without practice can understand the reality of this world and overcome the dualities of life. So, in the same way that telling you that there's this light bulb and there's this thing called electricity doesn't bring light into a room. So you have to turn on the electricity to be aware that that light, that electricity, that power comes into the bulb, and you switch it on, and then we get light. And in the same way, Tulsidas is saying that just knowledge of the Shastras is not enough to understand this level of superconsciousness, this awareness of infinity, that Satyam, Jnanam, and Anantam Brahma. We have to, through practice, know it for ourselves. And when we know it for ourselves, we can confirm it through the Shastras. And through practice, Vairagya, Abhyas Vairagya Abhyanta Nirodha. So detaching from the objects of experience and the constant practice of placing our awareness in that aim of life, that Purusha, that Paramatma, that Param Brahma, will certainly at some stage take us to that state of consciousness called Nirodha, without limitations, which is the Nirbija Samadhi, the Nirvana. So there's a few tools that can help us on the way. Bhakti. Now, bhakti, you can understand coming from the word meaning bhaj, worship. Now, the opposite of vibhakti, I'll take to you from Sanskrit, because vibhakti means all of the different word structures, the case endings in a Sanskrit declension. So that indicates separation, classification, grouping. So if that's the opposite of bhakti, then bhakti must also reflect unity. So this concept of worshipping is actually, this concept of bhakti is actually that realization of that unity in the diversity, that ekatvam anupashyati, ekatvam anupashyata. So in our practices in daily life, the Gita tells us, Yat karoshi yadasnasi yajuhoshi tadasi yat yata pashyasi kaunteya tat kurusva madapanam. So whatever we eat, offer and sacrifice, do in tapa, austerity. We need to have that feeling of giving it to that ultimate consciousness, because when we do that, we will be freeing ourselves from yearning for the fruit of the action. We will be offering it up to the divine, and we will free ourselves of any of the good and the bad results. And in the Mandukya Upanishad, we also hear, Jushtam yada pashyantam Jushtam yada pashyantan anyamisham asyam iham anam itivita shokha. So, when we're able to turn our real eyes, when we visualize towards that infinite divine consciousness, realize that divinity, realize that unity, that bhakti, we become free from sorrow and grief. And that is what vita shoka, that is what liberates us from that pain. So whatever we do in life, offer it up to the divine. Be aware of that infinity around us. And Bhartrihari said that the vow of service is very hard, and even great yogis have not been able to follow it and complete it. But through divine grace, through that kripa, we can attain that. And I mentioned that we have the individual intellect, the ego, and then we have the mind, the chitta, on the individual level. And so sacrificing the ego is also really important, because only then does the buddhi become without movement, that we can get to that higher state of consciousness. So Patanjali said, Drikadashana Shaktayor Ekatma Deva Asmita. So Asmita is that I amness. Drikadashana Saktayor. So that identification of the seer with the seen is the only reason, ekatma taiva, is the only reason that we have this feeling of individuality, that leads to the creation of attachment and jealousy and fear, etc. And it's only ignorance, avidya, that is the cause of this, that we are looking towards the temporary instead of looking towards the permanent. And so through surrendering our ego, that Ishvara Pranidhana, surrendering into that infinite consciousness, is how we can get liberated from this identification of the seer with the seen, and that sense of doership, that I did something, because really I didn't do anything. So that real obstacle is wanting the desire of our practice, even in sadhana. And with faith and devotion, that bhakti, manake hara har, hare hai, manake jite jita. So the key is in our mind. It's our mind that makes us defeated or victorious. So it depends how we think. We can make the glass half empty or half full. And really it's this mind that is our great enemy, because our mind can be understood to be like a knife. A knife in the hand of a surgeon can do great good, but in the hand of a thief, it can take a life. And so it's our mind that is our best friend and our worst enemy. It's our mind that, first of all, we need to bring back under control. So we need to take control of how we think, and so how we interpret things that happen in our lives. It's really, our upliftment is in our own hands, to realize that eternal unity or to drown in the sorrows of individuality. So when we give our power away, when we rely on another to satisfy our desires, that is where we become weaker, whether that's in a relationship or a business partnership. The key is to have no expectations of that other partner, that other being. So you'll never be disappointed, one, but also take responsibility for our own actions and satisfaction of our aims. And then we will never be disappointed by others. And Ishopanishad says, probably one of the most important statements in life. Yasmin savani bhutani atmaiva bhuta vijanata tatra ko moha kashoka ekatva manupashyata. This is talking about realizing that unity in diversity. When we visualize that Paramatma in every being, in everything that's going on around us, so then for whom we're going to be, to whom we're attached, and who are we going to be suffering grief and sorrow from? Because if we realize that unity and diversity, when we can see, like through that colorless crystal, see things as they are instead of through the lenses of our individuality, then we become liberated. We become stable and free, surrendering everything up to that divine consciousness. And so it means that we don't have to shut ourselves away from the world and saying, oh, they're not good. Oh, that way of living, that's not right for me, and that's not good for me. You can be in the world, but you don't have to be of the world. You can be aware of that infinite existence and yet perform action without attachment in the world. So we don't need to be scared or allergic to the world itself, because without it, we can perform no action whatsoever. And another thing too important is about being regular in our practice. Like we eat food regularly, and we eat at least, most people eat at least twice a day. And so after about 8 hours, we start need a proper big meal again. But it only takes us a few minutes to fill our stomachs. So in the same way, if we practice meditation regularly, we'll be able to maintain that level of stability that we get in meditation at that point in time, and can carry it on until we sit down to do meditation again. And it's important to not see the world as a creation, as a separate thing, but to see a manifestation of your real self, to see it as a manifestation of that ocean of consciousness, which is what it actually is. So when you understand that, you no longer see your individual working life, your daily routine life as separate from your spiritual life. And the real seeker is tapaswadhyaya ishva pranidhanani kriya yoga. Ishva pranidhana. So having that austerity, studying yourself, studying what you really are, and balancing it with the study of the ancient texts, and that Ishvara Pranidhana, surrendering to that supreme consciousness, that helps us to maintain discipline and to lead a life of perfection. And perfection it is when we are identified with that infinite divine consciousness that is full of truth, full of knowledge, full of bliss, Satchidananda. Only then can we lead a life of perfection. Until then, it's simply a modified life. So be conscious in our routines of unity as opposed to the individuality. Be aware of that unity in the diversity. Realize that our separation, our real pain in life is that separation from our real selves. And realize that that is in everything. We don't just go to a mandir to worship that divinity, but it's here and surrounding us in every moment. That all-pervasive Paramatma is in the entire universe, that yata pinde tata brahmande, that which is in this universe, that all-pervasive Paramatma is within us as well. And when we can accept where we are in life at any point in time, that will bring peace, present moment, and even accepting those things that we think we don't want, accept them as prasad from the divine. We can lead a peaceful and happy life. So the actual practice, sit in a calm and solitary place. Sit in a stable posture. Control your breath. Purify, cleanse your internal nervous system and organs, and turn your mind inwards towards that infinite divine consciousness as opposed to the objects of the senses, and have your be fixed on one point. And you can do that with mantra. Mantra means mananatrayatiti mantra, that thing which protects us from the cogitations of the mind. So if we have that one point, like the pranava, the onkara, so that onkara is, according to the Samveda, a naturally uplifting sound, which is described as udgita shabda. And if we look at the physical, is at the throat, u at the lips, and that anga is up between going up to towards the eyebrows at the top of the nasal passages. And so if you don't have a mantra, this omkara is a wonderful place to start and end with. And the Patanjali Yoga Darshana finishes with a really divine expression in the sutra. He says, Purushartha shunyanam gunanam prati prasava kevalyam swarupa pratishta va chitti shaktir iti. So his Purusha Artha is that Dharma Artha Kama Mokshanam, those four aims in life. The Purusha Artha meaning the purpose of existence. And that purpose of existence is fulfilled when we transcend the gunas, gunanam, shunyanam gunanam, going beyond the realm of gunas. Gita also tells us about going beyond the three gunas, triguna rahitam, the gunas being Rajaguna, that overactivity, the Tamaguna, that inertia, and Satguna, that purity also. So transcending those gunas and being able to turn inside, pratiprasalva, enables us to return to be aware of our original source. Swarupa Pratishta. Swarupa is our original form. And we can become stable in that. That is the Kaivalyam. That consciousness is established in its real self. This is the aim of yoga. This is the aim of life. And this is what yoga actually is. That Kaivalyam, that eternal unity. And Gita finishes with it expressed in another way. Yatra Yogeshwara Krishno Yatra Pato Danudara Tatra Shri Vijayo Puti Dhruva Niti Matim Mama. So, this is telling us, wherever there's Sri Krishna, Yatra Yogeshwara, it says in English, the Lord of all yoga, but it's that highest existence of yoga, Yogeshwara, that ultimate manifestation. Whatever that ultimate manifestation of yoga, there you'll find Sri Krishna and Arjuna in that supreme consciousness, that unlimited, undivided Paramatma and Param Brahma that is full of that divine knowledge, truth, and bliss, and is eternal. Sri Krishna says there will be victory. Victory of what? Your individuality, your ego, your mind, your individual intellect. And there will be dharma, righteousness, niti. And Sri Krishna says that this is my opinion, that is what will be attained in that ultimate supreme consciousness, ultimate truth, ultimate knowledge, infinity, that eternal unity where we realize that we are that ocean as opposed to identifying with the wave. We become permanent, beyond sorrow, moksha, free of delusion. And moha se mukt is that free of that delusion. And Guruji in his own words said that the aim of life is happiness, and nobody can achieve happiness without peace. Peace is the result of a tranquil mind, and nobody can achieve a tranquil mind without stable wisdom. And stable wisdom is the result of meditation. So, ultimately, we're talking about that eternal unity, that state of consciousness of yoga, because meditation is yoga, and yoga is where we are united, undivided, ayodhya, where there's no battle between the individual and the universal, where we realize that universal consciousness, that is yoga, eternal unity. And with that, I'll say Hari Om Tat Sat and pause for any questions. The next session starts at 4:15, so we can take questions up to that time at the most. And if it finishes earlier, then we can come to the break in between. So feel free to ask your questions. And I think Jacqueline is moderating, I think. So feel free to ask any question.
I have a question here, Divya. What is... they said the world is a family. Why don't people act or feel this?
Well, this is the real question. This is because we are identified with the individual objects of the senses. We're identified with our individual desires. And so we get that me first, that I need to satisfy my desires is more important than anything else. And so as long as we have that attachment to the objects of the senses, that sense of lackness, that sense of completeness, we're always, looking for that permanent solution, but filling ourselves up with temporary solutions, which is separating ourselves from that sense of universality, which is where we experience that sense of oneness, that sense of the family. So it's really ignorance, that's all. So simple.
And I had another question. I heard turning your eyes within. How can I do that as a beginner?
It's very easy. Everything is step by step. Asanas and pranayama are really important tools to bringing that stability. And when we get that stability of mind through the practice of pranayama, where the thought and breath become balanced, calm, and quiet, you actually become naturally drawn within. Because when we talk about this Krishna, we're not talking about this form of a thing called Krishna. We're talking about a divine energy called Krishna. And Krishna means akarshan. Akarshan means that attracting power. So if you can imagine like that this supreme consciousness, this Paramatma, is like this big magnet. And you as an individual are these iron filings. And the Jivatma. And the thing that is stopping the iron filings reaching the magnet are our individual qualities, our individual desires, those three gunas. So through the practice of pranayama in particular, with meditation, with the mantra, having already got some stability, you actually find that the eyes naturally start to get drawn in with. We start by doing the practice of writing our mantra between our eyebrows, and we have open meditation classes every single day online. So you're welcome to come to these groups that we have every day, where we take you step by step through this. So just by practicing writing your mantra between your eyebrows, stabilizing your breath, one day you will be drawn inside. It's literally like being sucked inside, like into a vacuum. It will happen all of a sudden, and you won't know, in a sense, what's hit you, because you're suddenly like, oh, wow, what's that?
Thank you.
So I hope that answers that person's question.
I think so. Are there any other questions? Because I received more questions, but I don't know if anybody else wants to ask a question.
I see one question here that's come to me directly, which is, how would we get over this dilemma that freeing oneself from the ego, mind, and the intellect? In this process, we end up using the ego, mind, and intellect to get over this. Yes, we do. However, we do use the ego, mind, and intellect, but we also have a cosmic mind, ego, and intellect that also exists. And what happens is that we're using individual tools initially. We're using mantra. We're using our own practice. But we've got three bodies. We've got the physical body, the subtle body, and the causal body. And so these practices take us to be more and more subtle, such that we get to a point where we go beyond the being the doer. Now, that's very hard to explain what that means without experiencing it for yourself. But there comes a point where you are not doing the mantra, but that you are aware of the mantra. And so gradually we become less egocentric and more getting closer. It's like polishing that crystal, removing those impurities. So there's like a sanskara that supports us in our journey towards the goal of our real selves. So it's something that dissolves naturally in the individual sense on the way by itself. I hope that answers your question, actually. Are there any other questions? If there aren't other questions, we can either go to your stored questions, or I can bring the session to a close with mantra and we can go to the break.
It will be nice, I think, mantra. Thank you for your very inspirational lecture again. Thank you so much.
Pranam. Om Purnamadaha Purnamidam Purnahat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om